Hello. All right, we're good. It's time to begin. I'm sure some more people might trickle in. Let's start with the word of prayer and then we'll get into our class. Father in heaven, thank you for this time that we have to come together and study. Just thank you for your many blessings, God. We thank you that we're able to come together as we are so freely. We know that there are others in the world who are not able to come together so freely as we are in this country. We thank you for this country, and we thank you that by your grace we're able to enjoy the freedoms that we do. Be with us now and help us to clear our minds so that we can be attentive to your word as we study from this great book of Genesis. In your son's name we pray. Amen. All right, let's open up to Genesis chapter 24. That's where we're going to spend our time. Here in Genesis 24, the author of Genesis is beginning to move out of the story of Abraham and transitioning into the story of their promised son, Isaac. One reason we know that is because what brings us up to this point is a series of events that occurred immediately after the birth of Isaac that occurred in chapter 21 of Genesis. But this series of events begin with Abraham. After Isaac's born, Sarah requests of Abraham to send Hagar and Ishmael out to the desert. And what Abraham does is provide for them, knowing that God would continue to provide for them. Now, following those things, Abraham makes an agreement with Abimelech that he had previously deceived to never do so again. Now, in chapter 22, we read about the offering of Isaac as a sacrifice, which was a test of Abraham's faith that God would keep his promise to Abraham of a long line of descendants. And finally, in chapter 23, we read about the death and burial of Sarah, the mother of Isaac. So that's just sets for us some context that brings us into chapter 24, where we begin to read another story concerning Isaac, which is the choosing of a bride for Isaac that would become his wife, a woman by the name of Rebekah. Now, with that being true, in this story about the choosing of Rebekah, his bride, what we're going to do today is basically survey the chapter. It's a very long chapter, so I'm just going to take you on what I'm calling a whirlwind tour of Genesis 24, and consider for ourselves a few reasons as to why Rebekah was chosen as Isaac's bride. Now, the first reason we'll consider from verses 1 through 14 is that Isaac's bride was chosen because of this, what Abraham wanted for him. Then verses 15 through 21, we'll find that Rebekah was chosen because she was a servant. And finally, in the last chunk of the chapter, verses 22 through 61, Isaac's bride was chosen because of God's blessing on Abraham. Then verses 62 through 67 basically summarize the story for us. Now, the application of these things, we've made similar application before, as we'll find that God causes certain things to happen in our lives and does so for a reason. So we're going to just dive right in verses 1 through 14. We'll read the text as we need to, but we're not going to take time to read it all the way through because that's not our purpose today. But we will start in verses 1 through 4, where the author of Genesis introduces this section. And it says there, "Now Abraham was old, advanced in age, and the Lord had blessed Abraham in every way. Abraham said to his servant, the oldest of his household, who had charge of all that he owned, 'Please place your hand under my thigh, and I will make you swear by the Lord, the God of heaven and the God of earth, that you shall not take a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites among whom I live, but you will go to my country and to my relatives and take a wife for my son Isaac.'" Now, here in this introductory section, the author of Genesis reminds his readers that Abraham had been blessed by God in different ways. But then we have this account of a ritual that took place where an oath is made, and it consisted of placing a person placing their hand under a person's thigh. Now, this ritual that's described of the placing the hand under the thigh symbolized that the one taking the oath would ensure the wishes of the person would be carried out. Now, there's only one other instance where we read about this in the book of Genesis, and that's Genesis 47, verse 29, where Jacob asked Joseph to do the same thing and make an oath that Joseph would bury Jacob in the land of Canaan. And we're going to talk about that when we get that far in Genesis. Now, what's the oath being made? What are Abraham's wishes here? Right. So it's a bride for Isaac, but not from among the Canaanites. They're in the land of Canaan. But so where does he want Isaac's bride to come from? From his own people. So that's what the author of Genesis is wanting us to see here, that this bride for Isaac would come not from among the Canaanites, but from among Abraham's own people, his own country, his own relatives even. Questions or comments on that? Okay. Now again, we're going to move pretty quick through this, but so that brings us into verses 5 through 9. This conversation between Abraham and his oldest servant continues, and there's a question that is asked here concerning the possibility that the woman chosen from among Abraham's relatives might not follow him, in which case the servant asked Abraham if he should take Isaac back to Abraham's homeland. But let's read the text and then we'll discuss it. Again, verse 5, the servant said to him, suppose the woman is not willing to follow me to this land. Should I take your son back to the land from where you came? Then Abraham said to him, beware that you do not take my son back there. The Lord, the God of heaven, who took me from my father's house and from the land of my birth, and who spoke to me and who swore to me, saying, to your descendants I will give this land. He will send his angel before you, and he will take a wife for my own son from there. But if the woman is not willing to follow you, then you will be free from this, my oath, only do not take my son back there. So the servant placed his hand under the thigh of Abraham his master, and swore to him concerning this matter. Now according to this text, what's the servant's concern here? The woman won't come with him. So he asks Abraham, what do I do when this is the case? Now, what's the servant's suggestion? It is a valid concern, absolutely. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, so it is a valid concern. Um, but what's the next question he asks? What does the servant think he should do if the woman won't follow? To take his son, to take Isaac back to the homeland. Now, how does Abraham respond to that? Absolutely not. Now, why would he say that? Why would Abraham say, don't take him back there? Okay, he may not want to come back. What are some other possibilities? Okay, Abraham is very old. Okay, he doesn't want his son away from him in his old age, but okay, could potentially jeopardize Isaac. Is, okay, what was God's promise? That so yeah, there's that as well. That is a very strong possibility here. God will promise to Abraham this land. Isaac leaves. It's possible that Isaac wouldn't come back, and something else that's jeopardized is God's promise, that they're going against what God promised. Now, these are just some possibilities. I'm not saying this is it hardcore because the text doesn't tell us, but we have to consider that. Elaine? Yeah. So, so again, these are just some possibilities, but that it's it's one we need to consider that this had something to do with Abraham not wanting to go against what God had said. Um, but so, what's the solution Abraham comes up with if this woman does not follow? You're free. You're free from this oath because there's nothing that can be done beyond that point. Anything else on verses 5 through 9? True. Absolutely. Right. Once that oath was made, it was kept. Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. And we're going to see later in the text that an angel is also involved in this process, which he did. Yeah. God did work out the way. So, anything else before we get to the next section? Right. The Canaanites were very, for lack of a better term, idolatrous people. Um, so this is not, they were likely not the kind of people that Abraham wanted his son involved with. Anything else? Okay. So coming into verses 10 through 14, the servant prepares for the journey. The text says the servant took 10 camels from the camels of his master, set out with a variety of good things of his master's in his hand, and he arose and went to the Mesopotamia, the city of Nahor. He made the camels kneel down outside the city by the well of water at evening time, the time when women go out to draw water. He said, O Lord, the God of my master Abraham, please grant me success today and show loving kindness to my master Abraham. Behold, I am standing by the spring, and the daughters of the men of the city are coming out to draw water. Now may it be that the girl to whom I say, Please let down your jar so that I may drink, and who answers, Drink, and I will water your camels also. May she be the one whom you have appointed for your servant Isaac, and by this I will know that you have shown loving kindness to my master. So, what does the servant do here? He prepares for the journey, and then what else does he do? He prays, puts the burden on God. Now, what kind of woman is he looking for, according to what he says there in verse 14? Compassionate one for sure, and a servant, one that demonstrates hospitality. Now, so with that in mind, what the servant seems to be doing here is just seeking a clear sign as to what kind of woman God wanted for Isaac. That's why he's praying, as was said, he put the burden on God. Questions or comments on that? Okay. Yeah, absolutely. Seek that guidance. Now, there are all kinds of different situations. This is just one where he is seeking guidance. So we see that he puts these, I don't want to say conditions, but just seeking for a sign from God. What kind of woman do you want for Isaac? So he says this, please. It's this kind of woman who says, Let down your jar so that I may drink, and who answers, Drink, and I will water your camels as well. So it's a woman who, among other things, demonstrates hospitality. Anything else? Okay. So if we were to just boil this down to a point, this is all hinging upon Abraham's wishes. So that's how this whole thing begins, is that Isaac's bride would be chosen because of Abraham's wishes. So that brings us into a second point we'll see from the text of verses 15 through 21. And we'll see that Isaac's bride was chosen because she was a servant. So again, verse 15, before he had finished speaking, behold, Rebekah, who was born to Bethuel, the son of Milcah, the wife of Abraham's brother Nahor, came out with her jar on her shoulder. The girl was very beautiful, a virgin, and no man had relations with her. And she went down to the spring and filled her jar and came up. Then the servant ran to meet her and said, please let me drink a little water from your jar. She said, drink, my lord. She quickly lowered her jar to her hand and gave him a drink. And when she had finished giving him a drink, she said, I will draw also for your camels until they have finished drinking. So she quickly emptied her jar into the trough and ran back to the well to draw, and she drew for all his camels. Meanwhile, the man was gazing at her in silence to know whether the Lord had made his journey successful or not. So this section is introduced with the author introducing to his readers the woman that would be chosen for Isaac, this woman named Rebekah. This is the first time we see her name. Now, what's the servant doing when Rebekah appears? He's still praying before he finished speaking to God in prayer. So God is basically beginning to answer the prayer before it's even finished. So with that being the case, in the remainder of verse 15, the author records just some details about Rebekah. She's the daughter of Bethuel, the son of Milcah, who was the wife of Abraham's brother Nahor. Now, in this statement, the author is recalling something we read in Genesis 22, verses 20 through 23. Rebekah was the daughter of Bethuel, who was one of 8 children born to Nahor, the brother of Abraham. So here's the connection to Abraham that the author is showing. So he wants his readers to see this woman would fulfill Abraham's wishes, that she be among his own country and relatives. So in addition to those things, however, the author is also emphasizing the answered prayer of the servant. Again, this happens as he's still praying. With that being the case, we get a further description of Rebekah. She was very beautiful, a virgin. No man had relations with her. And she went down to the spring and filled her jar and came up. Again, it's the answer to the prayer that is being emphasized, but it's being answered in the fullest possible way. This woman's attractive, but she's also fulfilling the specific wishes of the prayer. Before I go on, any questions or comments before I look at verses 17 through 21? Elaine? Yeah, absolutely. God had in mind a very specific woman for Isaac. Now, the servant doesn't realize it until this point, but this is the woman God had chosen for Isaac. So, this section concludes let me rephrase that. Now, what's the servant doing as Rebekah's doing all this there in verses 17 through 21? What's his response? Mm-hmm. Right. Exactly. That's exactly what he's doing. Is he remains silent, and he's basically studying this woman, asking himself, the text says, whether the Lord had made his journey successful or not. So he's beginning to realize, is this the woman God has chosen, by silently watching her? And so putting verses 15 through 21 together, the point we should see from these verses is that Isaac's bride was chosen because she was a servant. So the author has shown that Isaac's bride was someone who had a servant's heart, And this is demonstrated in the fact that she showed hospitality toward Abraham's servant as well as his camels. Andrew, go ahead. Yeah, that is a lot. Yeah. Hmm. Absolutely. Yeah, and he'd also asked for the camels as well. So yeah, absolutely. Yeah, true. No, you're right. He didn't ask her, but in his prayers, where he asked that he also water the camels. Yeah. So, so yeah. Anything else? Yeah, and that's what he. Yeah, it was God's intervention. We might say His providence being seen there. So, she was. All right. Anything else? Okay. We'll go to the last section, verses 22 through 61. Here's we won't take time to read through the text, but at least not as much as we have. But this section is introduced in verses 22 through 26. There's a conversation between Rebekah and Abraham's servant. Now, when you read these verses, I will just go ahead and read them. When the camels had finished drinking, the man took a gold ring weighing a half shekel and 2 bracelets for her wrists, weighing 10 shekels in gold, and said, "Whose daughter are you? Please tell me, is there room for us to lodge in your father's house?" She said to him, "I am the daughter of Bethuel, the son of Milcah, whom she bore to Nahor." Again she said to him, "We have plenty of both straw and feed and room to lodge in." Then the man bowed down low and worshipped the Lord. We'll pause there. Now, what's the servant doing at this point, and what's going on between he and Rebecca? Okay. Okay, he's confirming her lineage. What else is he doing? He was asking for a place to stay. So he's getting more acquainted with this woman, and in the process, he does ask for a place to stay for him and his camels. Now, what does he do at the end of this? There in verse 26. He bows his head and worships God. So, what seems to be going on here is that he's thankful that God has answered his prayer in a very magnificent way, um, that went even beyond his own expectations. And that's often what God does in prayer. He doesn't only answer our prayers, but he answers our prayers in more ways than we could have imagined. Um, Anything else on that section before we go to verse 27? Yeah, absolutely. That's true. So, and that's just how things worked back then. So, anything else before we go to verse 27? Okay. Now, verse 27, we're just looking at it by itself because it's a statement of praise to God. He says there, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of my master Abraham, who is not forsaken, or who has not forsaken his loving kindness and his truth toward my master. As for me, the Lord has guided me in the way to the house of my master's brother." Now, what's he praising God here for? An answered prayer. That's true. Quick, swift, answered prayer. So it's a statement that emphasizes God's blessing on Abraham and his guidance to this woman, and it's all part of that answered prayer. So God is helping Abraham as well as the servant to find a bride for Isaac. So having recorded those things, in verses 28 through 53, the author records another conversation which occurs between Abraham's servant and Rebekah's brother Laban, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. It says, and the girl ran and told her mother's household about these things. Now Rebekah had a brother whose name was Laban, and Laban ran outside to the man at the spring. When he saw the ring and the bracelets on his sister's wrist, and when he heard the words of Rebekah his sister, saying, this is what the man said to me, he went to the man, and behold, he was standing by the camels at the spring. And he said, come in, blessed of the Lord. Why do you stand outside, since I have prepared the house and a place for the camels? So the man entered the house. Then Laban unloaded the camels, and he gave straw and feed to the camels, and water to wash his feet, and the feet of the men who were with him. But when food was set before him to eat, he said, I will not eat until I have told my business. And he said, speak on. So he said, I am Abraham's servant. The Lord has greatly blessed my master, so that he has become rich, and he has given him flocks and herds and silver and gold and servants and maids and camels and donkeys. Now Sarah, my master's wife, bore a son to my master in her old age, and he has given him all that he has. My master made me swear, saying, you shall not take a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites, in whose land I live. But you shall go to my father's house and to my relatives, and take a wife for my son. I said to my master, suppose the woman does not follow me. He said to me, the Lord before whom I have walked will send his angel with you to make your journey successful. And you will take a wife for my son from my relatives and from my father's house. Then you will be free from my oath when you come to my relatives, and if they do not give her to you, you will be free from my oath. So I came today to the spring and said, O Lord, the God of my master Abraham, if now you will make my journey on which I go successful. Behold, I am standing by the spring, and may it be that the maiden who comes out to draw, and to whom I say, please let me drink a little water from your jar. And she will say to me, you drink, and I will draw for your camels also. Let her be the woman whom the Lord has appointed for my master's son. Before I had finished speaking in my heart, behold, Rebekah came out with her jar on her shoulder, and went down to the spring and drew, and I said to her, please let me drink. She quickly lowered her jar from her shoulder and said, drink, and I will water your camels also. So I drank, and she watered the camels also. Then I asked her and said, whose daughter are you? And she said, the daughter of Bethuel, Nahor's son, whom Milcah bore to him. And I put the ring on her nose and the bracelets on her wrist. And I bowed low and worshipped the Lord, and blessed the Lord, the God of my master Abraham, who had guided me in the right way to take the daughter of my master's kinsman for his son. So now if you are going to deal kindly and truly with my master, tell me, and if not, let me know, that I may turn to the right hand or the left. Then Laban and Bethuel replied, the matter comes from the Lord, so we cannot speak to you, bad or good. Here is Rebekah before you, take her and go, and let her be the wife of your master's son, as the Lord has spoken. When Abraham's servant heard their words, he bowed himself to the ground before the Lord. The servant brought out articles of silver and articles of gold, and garments, and gave them to Rebekah. He also gave precious things to her brother and to her mother. Big section. But what's going on here in verses 28 through 53? What is the servant doing? He's telling them the story about what's happened up to this point. So, Laban welcomes Abraham's servant after hearing from Rebekah all that had occurred up to this point, and a meal is served. But Abraham's servant says, let me tell you what happened, about how greatly the Lord has blessed Abraham, and how Abraham made him swear that Isaac's bride would not come from among the Canaanites. He recounts how Abraham said that if a woman would not follow, the servant would be free from this oath. He tells Laban about his prayer to God concerning the woman, and how his prayer was answered before it was even finished. So speaking in his heart. And so we have Laban's reply. How does Laban respond to this in verses 50 and 51? What does he realize, in other words? this is from the Lord. And so he says, well, if this is from the Lord, I can't argue with it. And as a result, in verses 52 and 53, what does the servant do? Bow down to the ground and worship God. And in addition to that, he gives gifts to Rebekah, her brother, and her mother. Anything else before we get to verses 54 through 61? Yeah, true, true. So, so yeah, the servant's letting them know that Rebekah would be taken care of. Anything else? Okay. So after that conversation, in verses 54 through 61, we find a final conversation that occurred the following morning after Abraham spent the night with Rebekah's family. It says, then he and the men who were with him ate and drank and spent the night. When they arose in the morning, he said, send me away to my master. But her brother and her mother said, let the girl stay with us a few days, say 10. Afterwards she may go. He said to them, do not delay me, since the Lord has prospered my way. Send me away that I may go to my master. And they said, we will call the girl and consult her wishes. Then they called Rebekah and said to her, will you go with this man? And she said, I will go. Thus they sent away their sister Rebekah and her nurse with Abraham's servant and his men. They blessed Rebekah and said to her, may you, our sister, become thousands of 10,000s, and may your descendants possess the gate of those who hate them. And Rebekah arose with her maids, and they mounted the camels and followed the man. So the servant took Rebekah and departed. So this is another conversation. What does this conversation consist of? That's it. So this is saying, well, let her stay a few more days before we send her off. So there's some disagreement as to when they would leave. So we notice that the conversation that occurs here concerns just that, when she would leave. As a result, there's disagreement as to whether Rebekah should leave immediately or after a few days. They suggest 10 days. So, being that this disagreement exists, as Elaine pointed out, Rebekah is consulted and she says, I'll go. So they leave immediately. So Rebekah leaves with Abraham's servant. Who does she leave with? Her own servant, a nurse or just some kind of servant, and the blessing from her family. Now, what there in verse 60, what does her family want for her? Okay, fertility and good things. So yeah, that it's that descendants language again. Now that blessing can also includes, may your descendants possess the gate of those who hate them. This is just the idea that she would become prosperous and just that she'd be successful over any potential enemies, is the idea there. So Rebekah leaves not only with her nurse, but also any other servant she might have had, and they leave. So this is all, but what we should see from these verses is that this was all part of God's blessing. This all still comes back to God's blessing on Abraham. And that's why this search for Isaac's bride was successful. So with that being the case, these verses should also leave us with the impression that the success of the servant's journey was a direct result of God's promise to Abraham that he would have a long line of descendants that would come through Abraham, Isaac, and eventually Jacob and his 12 sons. So that brings us into the conclusion. It says, now Isaac had come from going to Beer Lahai Roy, for he was living in the Negev, Isaac went out to meditate in the field toward evening, and he lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, camels were coming. Rebekah lifted up her eyes, and when she saw Isaac, she dismounted from the camel. She said to the servant, "Who is that man walking in the field to meet us?" And the servant said, "He is my master." Then she took her veil and covered herself. The servant told Isaac all the things that he had done. Then Isaac brought her into his mother Sarah's tent, and he took Rebekah, and she became his wife, and he loved her. Thus Isaac was comforted after his mother's death. Now, how does this story conclude? In verse 62 through 67, what happens? They finish the journey. So, the section of the story of Isaac and his bride, consists primarily of Isaac's first encounter with Rebekah. So, verse 62 and 63, Isaac's living in the Negev. What's he doing when they're approaching? What's Isaac doing? Meditating. Okay. Now, praying and meditating are very similar. Like I said, they're similar to praying, but meditating involves more of the thinking behind the praying. Now, what he's thinking about, the text doesn't tell us. It's possible about his bride that the servant's on. So this gives us some insight into where Isaac lived and what he was doing. He was a thinking man. Now, as a result, in verses 64 and 65, what does Rebekah do? Okay, she covers her face. That definitely comes out. She asks who he is. Yeah. Who is this man? Now, how does the servant identify Isaac? His master. But I thought Abraham was his master. Yeah. Yeah, that's it. Now, Isaac would be master by virtue of the fact that he is Abraham's son. But we also notice here, as Elaine pointed out, she covers her face. And this was a common act of respect. This isn't necessarily a religious thing. It was just an act of respect toward men who were of upper class. In our own lingo today, Abraham and Isaac would be in the upper class by virtue of their wealth. So she covers her face out of respect. So Abraham and Isaac both function as masters to this slave because, yes, Isaac is the heir. Now, with those facts having been established in verses 66 and 67, the servant recounts his journey to Isaac, at which point Isaac takes Rebekah into Sarah's tent, makes her his wife, and the text says he loves her and receives comfort from his mother having died. Now, with all that being true, verses 62 through 67 basically summarize the story of the choosing of Isaac's bride, and it really brings to a close the story of Abraham and Sarah, because now from this point, the author will transition into telling his readers more about the life of Isaac that begins in chapter 25. Again, this has been a whirlwind tour of chapter 24. Any questions or comments? Absolutely. Absolutely. There is a great deal of faith being displayed here. Absolutely. Absolutely. They all had a great deal of faith. Dad, go ahead. That's true. Yeah. She, yeah, was going with the servant. Anything else? Okay. So, when we look at all of chapter 24 together, the choosing of Isaac's bride was something that happened for a reason. Abraham wished for Isaac to have a bride. It happened because Rebekah was a servant, and finally, and most importantly, it happened because of God's blessing on Abraham. So everything in our lives happens for a reason. That's one application we can take from this. Genesis 24 also reminds us that we should be seeking God's guidance in our things. That was already pointed out. But if that's our mindset, the closing verses of this chapter indicate that we'll be rewarded as a result of having searched for God's guidance. Now, these are just a few things that we can learn from the things we've studied today. Any other questions or comments? Okay. Dean, will you close us in prayer today?